In 1969, the Beatles released the song Something on the White Album. The song is primarily written by George Harrison, and in my opinion, it is a perfect progression. So what I want to do in this video is really deeply analyze each chord in this song and try to figure out a little bit about why it works so well and why it sounds so good, why it complements those lyrics so well. To do this, we're going to rely on a little bit of the music theory that I've taught here on this channel, and I'm also going to introduce a few new concepts that we haven't discussed here before. Now, there is a lot to get to in this song, so I'm just going to start right off by playing the first 4 chords and singing the melody. I'm not that great of a vocalist, so I'm going to drop the melody down an octave so I can actually keep up with it. It sounds something like this. Something in the way she moves attracts me like no other lover. Simple stuff, right? 4 little chords there. I got a C major, a C major 7, a C7, and an F major. And there's a lot we have to talk about with just these 4 little chords here. The first obvious thing here is the chromaticism. In my C major, I have a C note, and a half step below C is the note B. That occurs in my C major 7 chord. A half step below B is B flat, and that's in a C7 chord, and then a half step below that would be A. So I've got that natural chromaticism occurring through those 4 chords right there, that kind of descending, sliding, falling feeling right there. And I really want you to associate that with the lyrics too and try to understand, this is a love song, and these first few lyrics, it's just that kind of sedative, almost like drugged effect of, euphoric, just sinking back in your seat. That's the impression I get from that chord progression just naturally all on its own, even without the lyrics. But you can guess how well this kind of chord progression will complement lyrics about something as like a love song like this is. I also brought up this whole concept in my Beach Boys video, which is on Kokomo. It's an older video, but it starts almost the same. It starts with a C major, a C major 7, and then a G minor instead. There's a B flat in that chord too, and then it takes you to F. So the same effect there. You still get that descending chromaticism just through 2 different mechanisms. Here, we're using a secondary dominant chord. C7 is the dominant chord of F. So I'm thinking of this as a C major, my tonic, still my tonic chord, just a C major 7. This I think of as the 5 of my 4, a secondary dominant built off the 4 chord to take me to my 4 chord. Whereas in Kokomo, that G minor was just a borrowed chord. We had just borrowed that from the parallel minor. So same kind of effect here, just subtly different. It's also important to note that really these first 3 measures is just a C major triad with a melody that's descending underneath it. And this is commonly referred to as a line cliche. When you have a steady triad and you have a melody that either goes down in stepwise motion, doesn't have to be chromatic, it just has to go down in steps or up in steps, and that's known as a line cliche. We hear that quite a bit in different compositions. We're actually going to see it a little bit later on here in this exact same song in a different context. But just to show you an example of what a line cliche might be in a different variation, what if I was on a C major and I went to a C add 9? I still have my C major triad intact, but my melody is lifted up. Now let's bring in like a sharp 9 or a flat 3 for that ugly, unresolved feeling right there. And if that was your melody, you could actually make that work. C, D, D flat, then E. So that's another example of what a line cliche might sound like, just in the opposite direction. Now we're only going to tackle the next 2 chords here, right? We just went from C, C major 7, C7 to F. Now we're going to a D7. Something in the way she woos me to a G. And if you see this D7 came out of the middle of nowhere, right? It's definitely not in the key of C, but anytime I see a 7th chord that's out of key, I ask myself, is a secondary dominant? Is this the dominant chord of a chord that's in my key? And the answer is yes. D7 is the dominant chord of G. And there it is, functioning just like a regular secondary dominant, taking me to my G chord. So nothing too fancy there. But I want to think about the chromaticism that occurs here, right? We just were on an F, which has a natural F in it. And then we went to a D7, which has an F sharp in it, that's a half step above. And then we went to a G, which is a half step above that, right? So we've got this ascending chromaticism now, something, it's a something in the way she woos me. And I think if you contrast that with where we were just at, right? We had the descending, right? That sliding, kind of sedative, that blissful kind of euphoric chromaticism. Now we've got a little bit of almost anxiety, maybe something new is about to occur. You know, what's the next step of this story? We don't really know. It's taking us somewhere, and it's a little uncertain where it's going to take us yet. And I think that's a really cool trick where they're playing us here. We come from this F, chromatically ascending to D7, to the G. We're set up for a C major landing, right? G wants to take us to C, but they're not going to give you the C major. We go from F, we go from D7 to G to A minor. For I don't want to leave her now. And that would be like a deceptive cadence right there, resolving to the 6 instead of to my 1. And it's helpful to think of this next part of the progression as kind of being in the key of A minor. I know A minor and C major are the same thing, but let's just pretend, for example, that we're in the key of A minor and that this is our tonal center. What we're going to get now for the next part of the song is an A minor, an A minor major 7, an A minor 7, and then a D9. And if I look at that in the key of A minor, I see myself just thinking of another line cliche. Here I am on my tonic, and then I'm still maintaining my A minor triad. I'm just adding in a note below my tonic, which is A flat. And then I'm going down another half step to a G. So this note just went from A to G sharp to G, A minor major 7, A minor 7. And then in my D9, there's also an F sharp. So I've got more chromaticism again in this part of the song. So the only 3 sections we've learned here are just chromatic steps down, now chromatic steps up, and then chromatic steps back down. And you would never really guess it just on your first listen that all of that weird little side-by-side stuff is occurring through there. And I really think it's subconsciously what gives this chord progression so much of its, so much of that great feeling, that emotional roller coaster. You're going up, you're going down. There's some uncertainty. There's some anxiety. There's some bliss there. It's really wonderful. So if I was in the key of A minor, it's pretty easy to think of this D9 as being borrowed from like A Dorian, right? That being the major 4 chord right there. But we've already seen that this D7, and it's pretty close to being a D9, right? D7 was functioning as a secondary dominant before, and it took me to G. Here, my D9 is not going to function as a secondary dominant. It's going to just take me to an F chord instead. And that's why I like to think of it as just being like a little bit of A Dorian, but it's the same thing. You can think of it either way. A lot of the things, get a little blurry here, and they can't be heavily defined one way or the other. So if you want to look at this D as being a borrowed 2 chord, sure, you can think of it as being borrowed from the paralleloidian. You can think of it as a secondary dominant. I'm thinking of us as temporarily being in A minor. And then that D9 just being like going to the 4 chord in Dorian, giving me a little bit of that Dorian brightness. But now we've got the turnaround, and this is actually how the song starts. I skipped the intro, but this turnaround is really funky. There's a lot to try to explore here in our little turnaround. It's got the surprising little nature to it. So the turnaround here after my D9 is an F major chord to an E flat major to a G over D and then back to C. So that progression again goes like this: F, E flat, G over D to C. And what's going on here? Well, the F makes sense. That's my natural 4 chord, right? And then the E flat is way out of key. Who knows where E flat comes from? We're in the key of C. How does the E flat major chord relate to there? Well, it's a chromatic median. It's a minor third away. It could be borrowed from C minor. If you think about the chords in C minor, well, E flat is in there. So we could think of that as a borrowed chord. And I honestly think that's our best bet to interpret it as. Imagine if I dropped the E flat completely. All I'd be left with is F, G, C, right? Which is just 4, 4, 5, 1. F to F and G and C. That's a 4, 5, 1. It seems like that's what we're doing here, except we've interrupted it with an E flat. We've interrupted it with a borrowed chord. So instead of just doing 4, 4, 4, 5, 1, we did 4, and then we had this weird borrowed chord, E flat, and then to my 5 chord to resolve to 1. So my theory here is if all we got to do is just stick a borrowed chord in between my 4, 5, 1, then we should be able to get some similar sounding effects out of that. So let's try it. Another borrowed chord from C minor would be A flat, right? A flat major. So let's do the same thing. Let's sub in an A flat major and hear what it sounds like. So instead of F to E flat, now I'm going to go F to A flat. And you hear that actually sounds pretty nice. It's a different effect, but it has a very similar effect, right? Let's take a look at another chord I could borrow from C minor. In C minor, I could borrow a B flat major. So now let's go from F to B flat major, to G, and then to C. All right, and if I do that in a slightly different voicing, it'll probably sound pretty good. Listen, F. So here's that same kind of concept that I just stole from this song. Hey, let's take a 4-5-1, but really quickly, before you get to that 5, throw in some goofy borrowed chord, something out of key, and the 4-5-1 will still preserve itself. It's still such a strong cadence that you don't, it seems like you could get away with murder right there, because that 4-5-1 is still going to hold itself together. I'm really curious to find out how many other chords you could stick in there and still have it work. So that entire thing is going to repeat all the way through, except at the very end, our turnaround doesn't resolve to C, it resolves to A, which is very unexpected. And I can't tell you exactly where that kind of modulation comes in. We were in the key of C, now we're in the key of A. And that's a pretty drastic change. We went down a minor third to a brand new key. And that's not common. I can't find you any other examples off the top of my head of where you just modulate down a minor third. Pretty unique, and I like the effect of it. But what's cool is once that A major gets there, you just settle in at home. Now A major is our new key. So let's take a look at this next section, starting on A. A major to C sharp minor over G sharp. F sharp minor, A over E. D, then a G, and then an A with this funny chromatic bass descent. The lyrics are, you stick around, now it may show. And I don't know. So what we're going to be doing here is in the key of A, right? We started on our tonic chord, A, and then we're going to be doing what is commonly referred to as a lament bass. The bass is just going to go down, and it's going to go all the way down until it reaches our 5th. So it's going down a full 4th. It goes down from A, and then we're going to go down to G sharp, which is our natural 7th. We're going to go down to F sharp, our natural 6, and then down to E. That's what's happening on our bass. A, G sharp, F sharp. A, G sharp, F sharp. And the chords that can supplement that are A major. There is a G sharp in my natural 3 chord, right? So I took my natural 3 chord, which is C sharp minor. We plopped the G sharp on the bass. That helps provide that bass movement. Now I'm going to my 6 chord, keeping it in root position, and that gives me the positioning there. And then back to my tonic chord, A major. But we've put an E on the bass. And that helps me play these 3 simple chords, A, C sharp minor, F sharp minor, and A. But it sounds different because of the bass movement. A over G sharp, the C sharp minor is, F sharp minor, and then A over E. So it's a really nice way to spice up some boring, bland diatonic chords. There's nothing special about A major, C sharp minor, and F sharp minor, but the bass movement there, that kind of keeping that lament bass idea, gives it this nice fluidity and really reinforces this A major tonality now that we're finally into it. However, we're going to break the A major tonality here a little bit. We go to our diatonic 4 chord, which is a D, which takes us straight to a G major, right? And G major's not in the key of A. I think of it as just being the flat 7 chord, as being borrowed from like A mixolydian or being borrowed from A minor. But that flat 7 chord, that G major, will really take you back to your tonic really well. It's called a backdoor resolution. Instead of coming from like a 5 to your 1, we're coming from our flat 7 to our 1. And it resolves very well. Here's an A major, and coming from G, A feels at home. So to me, this is a little splash of mixolydian. When I see an A major, a D, and a G resolving to A, I think of A mixolydian. But you can parse it however you want. You can think of it as just being a borrowed chord or being just a backdoor resolution right there. Now this whole section repeats, but after we go through our lament bass, after we go through our borrowed chord with the G, it doesn't resolve to A, it resolves to C. And G was the 5 of C, so G should pull me to C, and it does here, but it's very unexpected. And I think it's so unexpected, it's hard to imagine us going into the key of C, but they just do it. They just start right back over, going over the old chord progression again, starting in the key of C. And it's very abrupt when you get it the first time, but you sink into it very, very well once those chords start coming back and you start hearing that chromatic descent again. That C major tonality is very familiar. It seems you're very glad to be back home at C major after you go through this A major thing. And it's not like it's tense. It's not like it's really ridden with anxiety. It's just so different than that comfortability of the C major home bass that we had before. It's a funny welcome home to finally land back in there. So really, that's the entire song. The only thing we haven't talked about is the very outro, which is the same thing we've seen before, that F major to an E flat, to a G over D, to a A, and then they just go right back to the turnaround again for F, E flat, G over D, and then C to finally resolve on our tonic. Now that we've gone through all this work, I want to talk a little bit about why we do this kind of work. I know there's a lot of comments. I get a lot of comments in here. You're not supposed to analyze music. You're supposed to feel it. And yeah, that's true. You are supposed to feel music. But I want to talk about this idea about not analyzing music. You know, I'm not as good of a songwriter as George Harrison. I know that's hard to believe, but it's true. And it's very helpful to look at what the pros did and see how it all works. You know, it's like, if I want to become a good chef, and let's say your grandmother makes a really good mincemeat pie, and I decide, well, I want to make a good mincemeat pie, it's not a good idea for me to go into the kitchen and just start throwing things together and just start feeling it, right? It would be very beneficial to maybe like analyze one of grandma's mincemeat pies first and see what was actually in it, or maybe ask for her recipes, or see what she did, see what ingredients she uses. Now, grandma might not be a professional chef. Grandma might not even know what she's doing. She might just be working off of instinct, but she's been making mincemeat pies for like 50 years, and I've made it in like 0 of them. So it's really not helpful to tell people, oh, you're supposed to just feel this. You're not supposed to analyze it. Well, if I analyze what he's doing, it makes me a better musician. I get better insight into what ingredients he was using and, how he was able to assemble the whole mincemeat pie. I could do that for 50 years. I could just experiment for 50 years and just try to get the experience out of it that way. But I find that a pretty inefficient way to learn things. It's much more helpful to stand on the shoulders of giants and learn from those people who really went through this path before you. Now, just a quick note, this guitar here you may not have recognized. It is a custom guitar from GTR Technologies. These are some guys that got a hold of me from Spring Grove, Illinois. Really nice guys, and they let me borrow this for a little while. I'm releasing a new acoustic track here pretty soon, and I wanted to use this for it. So thanks to them for letting me borrow this here for a while. You can check out their website in my description. There's some links below. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something, and I hope it got you thinking about chords and harmony a little bit better. If you did like this video, you can thank my very patient Patreon supporters for making it possible. Without them, these videos wouldn't exist. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.